Thank you for attending. My name is Russell Hittinger, and I am Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at Catholic U. IHE is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the criteria and the grounds conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing faculty from across the university, the country, and the world here to Catholic University to think about these questions. If there is an event on the campus here at Catholic University after 5 p.m., it's probably being brought to you by IHE. Let me see, is the president here? Peter? No, okay. I would also like to extend a special thank you to our co-sponsor, the Catholic Project, and Stephen White. And thanks too to our excellent IHE staff, Stephen Higgins, who is the managing director of the Institute, and Caroline O'Callaghan, who is our program manager and does an enormous amount of work organizing all of these events. One of our longest standing partnerships here at IHE is with Ross Douthat. And of course, he's a columnist for the New York Times, but also a media fellow here at IHE. We very much enjoyed his friendship and collaboration for many years, and particularly honored to host these conversations together. I know everyone at IHE and many people on campus await his every visit, as do our faculty and students and benefactors. We are grateful that he takes the time to travel here from his home in Connecticut to lead discussions with experts on pressing contemporary issues, from questions of international relations to challenges facing the family, domestic culture, and we found out last fall even flying saucers in American religion. Hard to beat. As a reminder, Ross and the panelists will begin by having a conversation, and then we will have some time for questions from the audience. And we invite everyone to join us afterwards for a reception with refreshments. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Ross, who will introduce our panelists. Ross.
Hear, hear. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. And before I introduce our panelists, I want to say that it is actually kind of remarkable that I have been an IHE Media Fellow hosting events like this one for going on many years, and this is actually the first time that I have had an opportunity to indulge my own once deeply crankish and now incredibly relevant and timely obsession with collapsing birth rates. So I'm really pleased, even more than the UFO and demonology panel. This is the fulfillment of a lifetime of obsessive scrutinizing of demographic tables. You know, while you were playing sports, I studied the blade. No, I read anyway, yeah, so, but in all seriousness, we're here tonight to talk about an issue that when I was a much younger conservative journalist, I think it was fair to say, was sort of the province of mostly right-wing, slightly crankish people who stared at long-term projections of population trends, mostly in Western European countries, and used them in arguments. In my case, usually it was arguments with my more liberal Catholic friends who wanted to invoke the beautiful, glorious welfare states of Western Europe as a counterpoint to the evils of, Anglo-Saxon capitalism. And I would say, well, how great can these welfare states be if, Western European birth rates are in steep decline relative to all of the rest of the world? That was the story, let's say, 20 or 25 years ago. Today, birth rates are in steep decline just about everywhere, all around the world. And even a moderate crank like myself has ended up somewhat surprised, and not in a good way, by just how far things have gone, to the point where it's entirely normal for some of the richest countries in the world to have birth rates at basically half of replacement level. That's where certain parts of Europe are headed, or even below replacement level, even well below half replacement level, to the point where a nation like South Korea has a birth rate probably below 0.7, which means that for every 2 South Koreans, there will be 0.68 South Koreans in some not really all that distant future. So this is kind of an extraordinary trend. And here to talk with us about this extraordinary trend and fix it tonight, all single members of the audience will be paired off. The Republic of Gilead will be declared. No. Please cut that from the trend. No. Anyway, here to talk about this subject, and in no way to implement a theocracy in America, we have the authors of 2 extremely timely new books that I think take very different and equally interesting looks at the phenomenon, focusing primarily on the United States, but I think the story that both of them tell has implications for the wider global dimension of the issue. So first, on my furthest left, appropriately, like the communist he is Tim Carney, columnist for the Washington Examiner, my fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of Family Unfriendly, which I would characterize as a book that looks at the question of declining birth rates sort of on the margin, meaning not the smallest part of the problem, but the part of the problem of why are people who could become parents not becoming parents, people who could choose to have 1 or 2 children not having 1 or 2 children, and why are people who have 2 children not choosing to have 3 children? That's sort of, I think, one way of looking at a lot of what Tim discusses. And then to his right is Catherine Pakaluk, who is a professor right here at Catholic University, who is the author of Hannah's Children, which is a sort of deep, sociologically rich look at not the margin, but the extreme, if you will, looking at families, but women in particular, who have chosen to have 5 or more kids, to not just sort of be outliers, but to be sort of signs of contradiction, effectively, in this culture. And I should say, for my own part, that my wife is expecting our 5th child in 4 weeks. Here. So, yes, I'm not sure where she is right now, but I'm sure she's fine. That's a joke, darling. But so it's good we have slipped in under the wire, maybe for the paperback edition of the book. So I'm just going to ask first Tim and then Catherine, who are both very practiced and accomplished speakers about their books, to talk for maybe 6 or 8 minutes each about what their project is, how it fits into this conversation, and then we'll just have a pretty open back and forth, and then open it up to all of you. So, Tim, I invite you to lead us.
Thank you, Ross. So I'm going to start with a bit of warning about what happens when you call Ross for advice. When I was finishing up the proposal on this book, I said, Ross, I want to write a book. It's about the baby bust in large part and how we can reverse it. He stopped me and he said, you're writing a how-to book about making babies? Are there going to be diagrams in this? And we then had a joke that went back and forth. About 6 months later...
Fake news.
About 6 months later, I get the same exact joke when my pastor asks what my book is about. He goes, oh, you're writing a how-to book about how to make babies. And so then I used the same line I did coming back to Ross. I said, yes, I'm going to call it the Carney Sutra. And Father Scalia scowled at me. But it's not about that. I go around the country and I talk to people who are parents who aren't parents. I did focus groups. I look at the sociology data, the economic data, and try to figure out, A, why people aren't having as many babies as they used to, why more people are having 0 babies, And why there's also, I think, the same part of the same phenomenon, an epidemic of childhood anxiety. And I think that economics can explain part of it, but it's woefully inadequate as an explanation. Richer countries have fewer babies. Richer people don't have more babies. Oh, we have fewer babies in 2019 when the economy was the best it ever was than we did in the depths of the Great Recession. And we have fewer babies last year than we did in any point during the pandemic recession. So you can't simply explain it by economics, and we'll get into that in more depth. And also the other answer that I would get, so there was this one point I went to Utah, which has a relatively high birth rate, but Salt Lake City is below replacement. And I was walking around this one neighborhood that looked like the perfect place to raise kids. It's called the Avenues. And, you know, the right size houses, trees that are about the right height and all of that stuff. And I didn't see any families. And then finally, at one point, I see this one couple, Isaac and Nicole. And I asked them, you know, do you guys have kids? Do you want kids? They said, no, we don't want kids. I said, why not? They said, we can't afford it. I said, what exactly is unaffordable? And Isaac says, everything, healthcare. But if I'm being honest, really, I'm just selfish. And I said, what do you mean? He says, Nicole and I always say, some people somewhere are going to be watching Teletubbies and cleaning up vomit, and we're going to be having margaritas in Paris. And seconds later, and I joke you not, up comes a lady pushing a double stroller, and the passengers in the double stroller are each chihuahuas. So I walk away from this encounter with my head reeling about this scene that seems like it's from Children of Men. And also, why would you go to Paris to have margaritas? But also those two explanations, too unaffordable and selfishness, are the two common explanations you get. Again, affordability of children, I don't think has changed much in the last 15 years. And then the selfishness, I also don't think has changed much in the last. My chart of selfishness is 0. Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and then 100, and it's flat since then. Blaming selfishness is like Boeing saying, oh, well, those planes crashed because of gravity. You build the airplanes, you engineer the airplanes to offset gravity. We engineer society to offset concupiscence, to offset our natural selfishness, to align the self-interest with the common good, to align the short-term interests with the long-term interests. So that is, we're not properly, our society is failing. Our society is failing to make people want to have kids. Our society is falling short on all of these ways. In other words, it is our culture that is family unfriendly. It is our culture in many ways. And I'll quickly just, parenting culture. Parents put in much more time on just parenting than our parents or our grandparents did. And some of that, dads being more attentive, is probably good. But on net, it's probably negative, because what does it mean? It means Little League is replaced by travel team trap. It means we're helicoptering because we're sure that every stranger is a well-trained kidnapper with a getaway car ready for us to escape. And then also mating and dating culture is way off. I think the apps, among other things, have broken our brain. And young people, there's this one guy who was interviewed by, I think, Kate Julian in The Atlantic, and he said he wanted to ask out this girl he really liked on his co-ed volleyball team, but he decided it would be inappropriate because the apps have given this idea of, oh, you have to get this double secret consent before you can even ask somebody out. And so I go around and I tell college kids, if you're on a co-ed volleyball team, it's not inappropriate to ask out the girls. The point of the co-ed volleyball team is meeting people of the opposite sex. It's not the volleyball. But ultimately, it's our culture's values that are off. And it's all tied to the over-parenting, to the strange new mating and dating norms, which is a belief in, in hyper-individualism, you could call it. But Stephanie Murray, who's a great parenting writer, she said, once having a kid went from kind of being what you did, you grow up, you get married, you have kids, you can opt out of it, have a celibate lifestyle or whatever, or you can, I always say, I'm not telling everybody to have kids. All of my favorite priests have no kids. But if you don't opt out of it, it's just kind of what you do. But now it's not that. It's a choice. It's part of intentional living. It's postponed and agonized over and planned very meticulously. And at that point, it does two things. In a culture where parenting is that, I mean, some people say the fact that parenting is a verb is a problem. But a culture where parenting is that meticulously chosen is one where, A, we feel we have to do it right. In my focus group, it was working class guys who said, I can't have kids because I need to give them the best of everything. And I thought, I give my kids the second best of everything, and I think that that's probably better. But also, it becomes your problem. It's your choice to have kids. Well, don't ask the rest of us to help. This is the biggest effect, I think, of sort of a contraceptive society, is that it said, well, kids were your choice. If Ross had a boat and it kept breaking down, I'd help him out for a little while, but eventually I'd say, Ross, you made the decision to buy a boat. And that's the attitude that people have. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, in opposing a family tax credit, said, I never thought it was society's job to raise other people, to pay, I forget exactly the phrasing, but basically, it's not our job to support other people's decision to raise kids. But it is our job. So that's the ultimate way in which our family is unfriendly, is that in this world where it just became your individual deliberate choice, we decided that freed up everybody else from having to help out. Catherine.
I'm so bewildered. I'm not sure where to start. It's very depressing. I was thinking, I don't have such a funny story to start with, but actually, I was thinking that part of what I think my book is after is there's a bit in a skit by a comedian by the name of Ivan Decker, who my kids love to listen to. Actually, we all love to listen to Ivan Decker, and he talks about how terrible it is to try to get in shape, and he talks about what happens when he goes out and he thinks he's going to run to the, he's going to run a mile, or he gets to the stop sign, and his whole body is screaming at him to stop. And you know what comes next? He says, you have to stop running. Nothing is chasing you. It's like, nothing is chasing you. Okay, so I think that might sort of get at the thing that I think what I'm trying to investigate in my book. So maybe just, Tim won't mind, I'll say that I think there's a little piece of something he said I want to build off of. So you said society doesn't set it up, so we want to do this thing anymore. So I think having kids is essentially super tough. It's super hard, especially hard on women, but it's very hard on breadwinners too. And I think that it's a little bit like running. Why would you do this? Is that nothing's chasing you? And that basically you'll do this thing if there's somebody chasing you. What do I mean by someone chasing you? This is the only way out, right? So that this behavior, having children, now, I think your contraceptive point is 100% important, right? So we'll get to that. You'll do this thing, people do this thing, people have historically done this thing because it was essentially meeting a need, really meeting a very important need. And so we can think about the fact that, sort of up into the place we now think of as the beginning of the demographic transition, the beginning of this slow march towards lower and lower total fertility rates. This is the time when children become increasingly less valuable to the household as labor. They become less valuable to the household into the 20th century as old age support. These are things that, even if you thought, well, gee, it's pretty tough to have a baby, but what would I do when I'm old if I don't have a few kids? And, you're not going to just have one if you need old age support, right? Because who would do that? I'm not counting on my first, but my third likes me more, so, these are sort of my characterizations of you're going to do this really hard thing because it's the sort of thing that you need to do, right? You need to do this. Heading into the 21st century, we chip away at the economic value that children have to the household. This is partially industrialization. It's partially a progressive schooling movement. It's partially pension programs. It's all of these things. And in a sense, what's left, right? What are the reasons? What's chasing you now? So the only other reason you might go running is if you really love to run. Somebody said yes. Well, you're not me. I don't love to run. I'm sort of like Ivan Decker. It's, I'm not running unless something's chasing me. So you'd love to. So what would cause you to want to run? And so in a sense, what I did is I headed out. I went to, around the country, and I said, look, in a 2-child world trending to a 1-child world, who still wants to have kids? Who wants to have more than 1.6 children? and why. And so in some sense, I could have asked people with 4, I could have asked people with 5. I picked 5, and that's a technical reason, just to really make sure I got bang for the buck out of this. We can debate that. But so what do you find out? You find out, are the people who, escape this falling birth rate trend? Like, who are these people? Are they people who have lower costs of having children? They say, I love pregnancy. Childbirth is easy for me. I have no labor pains, right? I have nothing else to do with my time. I hate all professions. I think women should always be at home and barefoot and pregnant. So this is, of course, is not what I found out. I found out that these are people who basically say, yeah, all that stuff is true. I really like my job, or I like the job that I was preparing to do. Maybe I still have a job that I really like. I like hobbies. I like sitting in the beach with margaritas. I heard that too. I like all of those things, but I have a very important reason why I think running or having children is really important. What are those reasons? What were the things? Children are blessings from God. These are specific beliefs. Blessings from God, expressions of God's goodness, and the purpose of my marriage. So those are the 3 things. Like, that's so I kind of went around and I thought, okay, these are the 3 things you believe. These 3 things make it, you might have 3 or 4, you might have 10, you might have 12. That's an interesting story. But these are the things that kind of provide resistance or immunity from this downward spiral. And so I tell those stories in the book and try to unpack that and put that in the terms of choice. And I try to discuss how the contraceptive revolution following on the Industrial Revolution makes that, puts that in living color. And that's it. We can start from there.
Yeah, so let me go straight into maybe points of tension, actually, between your arguments. Because I think that in, let's say, we're going to call it the Carney thesis, right? And this builds on, you build on a certain amount of research and arguments by other scholars and so on, right? But there's an idea basically that, yes, people, for all kinds of understandable technological, economic reasons, most people are just not going to have 7 kids anymore, right? And they weren't having 7 kids 300 years ago because they just loved having kids so much. They were having them for some of the reasons that Catherine described. They were also having more children because infant mortality was so high, and the number of children that survived to adulthood in most families was never 13 or anything like that, right? So all of that means you should expect fertility to settle at a much lower level. But I think in Family Unfriendly, there's a sense that most people still say they want to have kids. There's still a desire for kids in the developed world, in the United States. And lots of people say they want to have more kids than they end up having, right? So there's a failure to sort of complete your desired fertility, to use the sort of economic, sociological jargon, and so on. And so it makes sense to look in that landscape and say, look, this problem is sort of, it is a matter of, culture has gone awry in these ways, policy has gone awry in those ways, and we should be able to get back, not from, 1.4 to 5, but from 1.4 to replacement level, to a world where some of the big economic downsides of low fertility start to go away, right? And in Hannah's Children, we have more of a sense that, actually in a world where this is a choice, in the way I think you both would agree that it really has become a sort of a choice in this much more profound way than it's ever been in human history. Whatever people say their desired fertility is, you would not expect, maybe, you might expect a landscape like the one we have now, sort of independent of land use regulations, policy, and so on. And that was, at least that was sort of my takeaway from reading, of sort of the interesting tension between your arguments. So I'm curious, just for either of you, what you think of the alternate perspective, I guess.
I mean, I do think that if we had a properly ordered culture, we would have more children than we have now, even given the economic realities that Catherine points to that show, and the child mortality reality that shows why the birth rates would be much lower. I mean, we can just start with Gallup's question of what is the ideal number of kids to have, and the answer is actually rising, 2.7. Then there's lots of other numbers, and Lyman Stone I actually called him before I wrote the book. He's a demographer. I said, are you writing a book on this? He said, no. I said, okay, I'm going to write it. And actually,
he's too busy doing consulting work for countries with collapsing populations.
You know, how to short
and
diaper companies.
Diaper companies,
yeah. We're not going to make adult diaper jokes, are we? No, not tonight. So when Lyman also models these numbers for, ideal family size, and then intended number of kids, and then drop off to actual number of kids. And there's other ways of asking this in between. But what American women intend is above replacement, but significantly below their ideal. Now, that's normal in everything, right? What my ideal home would be is much bigger and grander than what I intend to buy. And then what I might end up with might be below that. But that deficit in this most meaningful part of human existence, basically, is something that we should be addressing. So that would be my first response, is that, yeah, we should expect intended and ideal fertility to be lower, given the fact that we separate the domestic and the productive activities, that we moved work out of the home, lower child mortality, et cetera. But we ought to change things so that people get at least what they want. And I would say there's another deficit, which is I would want people to want even more than what they're having. And that is a failure of sort of imagination and love, that we're not a little bit higher in that intended than we are. So I don't know, maybe I'm not accepting things that Catherine's accepting, or?
I think we agree about, I agree with what you said. I just think it's incomplete. So I think that, yes, women want to have, let's just say 3 is the ideal number, 2 points. Yep. The thing is, they also want to have jobs and careers. Literally, that's the problem. They want to have 2 things that are in conflict. And life is full of that. You can certainly, we could pick, we can say, if you survey American women, on average, we could get very precise about this. On average, the average American woman wants to lose 13.4 pounds. But she also wants to eat more or less what she likes to eat. I mean, so that's basically the problem. The major inflection point from above replacement to below replacement fertility rates happens in, starts roughly in 1960. Now, we can have a really interesting debate about how we should interpret the war period, right? But I'm not here to prove this. We already know this. I mean, basically, women's large-scale entry into the paid workforce is the thing that's in tension with having the children they say they want to have. So the question is not, so what you just described is 100% correct, and I agree with it. It's just that women also want something else. And they picked this. They have picked it, and they still pick it. So to get more children, you have to find some way, and I think this is what we've seen, you have to find some way to argue that this particular good, the children good, is of greater value or more importance, right? So you order the 2 things that you want, right? So that's how I would interpret the problem with the ideal and actual fertility.
Sure, but I think there's obviously other things that are in tension with family and with more kids besides just work. I think that's a big one. And one of the later chapters of my book says we ought to embrace and support more stay-at-home parents, which overwhelmingly will mean stay-at-home moms, and we ought to do it in all sorts of ways. So one of the few ways I praise my former county, Montgomery County, is that actually the libraries and the rec centers have a ton of things at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday that can be a mommy and me library hour or whatever. I said they should also have, if they want to be more gender equitable, daddy and me tool time at 10 a.m. as well. Yeah, not with power tools, of course. But but the other things that are so one story, and that I didn't end up including in the book, but there's this way of writing tweets that's like a two-part thing, and this one liberal journalist expecting his first kid. Step one was researches the costs of a night nurse. Step two was researches how to bring about a socialist revolution. The only ways he could imagine getting help with his children were on the market and from the state. And so this is a shortcoming of society. He didn't think, okay, my neighbors, my extended family, my church community, anything like that. So it's not just that work is interfering with this. It's that we know. I mean, so Robert Putnam and my last book, Alienated America, and Charles Murray and a dozen other people have written, people have less community support. They know their neighbors less. They go to church less. I don't know if bowling leagues are great supports for family, but they probably are. Probably, I mean, I think when my daughter was in the hospital at 11 months old, how our freezer was overflowing with casseroles. And everybody knows this story if you belong to things. That's the sort of supportive network. So the fact that work is this number one sucker of our time, and it interferes with family formation, does not mean that there aren't 100 other shortcomings in our culture that could encourage parents or encourage adults to get married and have kids, or encourage parents to have that third or fourth kid.
I wonder so Catherine, you talked about the 1960s as an inflection point, and obviously they were. But in America, as Tim talks about, another big inflection point was at the aftermath of the Great Recession, 2008 onward, right? And up to that point, I think you could tell a story where, you know, the United States had shown basically impressive resilience relative to Western Europe in terms of people having kids, right? And in fact, the U.S. is still resilient relative to South Korea, but the last 15 years we have, you know, declined towards what were European levels 15 or 20 years ago. And I'm curious what either of you think has changed just in that time period, right? Because female workforce participation has sort of leveled off a little bit in that period, right? So it's not, you know, we were at replacement level fertility with with women deeply in the workforce. And I mean, you guys can talk about the shift any way you want. I think both sort of technology and religious changes probably are sort of particular, but I'm just curious what your reading of the last 15 years of American life is in particular.
So yes, I do frame my book around that shift. Right. I tell the story of when my first child was born, how you remember every little detail of this. And one of the details was that while Katie was sleeping, I was out in this makeshift nursery in the hallway of Sibley Hospital and looking down at my daughter's face and just thinking, you know, what does her future hold? What you know, this perfect face. What's she going to look like as a toddler? Is she going to be a big sister? Is she going to go to Catholic University?
The big question.
The big question. As I'm looking at her and thinking about her future, the nurse comes up and says, "Sir, your child is 3 bassinets over. You're currently staring at somebody else's child." So A, I sometimes think about what happened to that other kid, but B, we were in the hallway in this overflowing of Sibley Hospital because in 2006, we had a record number of babies, almost record. And then in 2007, we had an actual record number of babies, more than at the peak of the baby boom. And the millennials were just becoming childbearing, like prime childbearing age. So we were supposed to have a baby boom, the media promised. The overpopulation people started freaking out about it again. And then, of course, it crashes. After I wrote the book, I was looking at month-by-month data, and I was telling Ross this earlier, and I found that it was the summer of 2008, in fact, before the actual crash, that birth numbers actually started to tick down. Now, there's all sorts of economic explanations. My daughter Lucy's explanation is that's when her little brother Charlie was born, and that people decided it wasn't worth it. It was also 12 months after the iPhone came out. And so I think the way technology has changed us. One explanation from a documentary I got to watch a few months ago was that these shocks just shake us. So even though we recovered from the financial crisis, it just made the millennials see life as so much more precarious. I don't think that's totally wrong either. But I think that a big part of it was that. I also think that the millennials were more, they were more helicoptered as kids. And so their view of what parenting is was much more daunting than Gen X, where, you know, it was come home when the streetlights turn on when we were little. And so I think those would be the things I would show. Life seemed more precarious after the financial crisis. The millennials were raised in a way that made family seem more daunting, and smartphones changed us for the worse.
But then, Catherine, what about religion? Because obviously one of the big takeaways from your book, I mean, you already said, right, is that in these outliers, faith predominates, right? And we've had this kind of second wave of secularization in America in the last 15 years. Is religion, basically, can you have replacement level fertility without strong religious belief?
So I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, of course, that's just like a prediction, but I don't think so. So I would say two things. I mean, one is this kind of increasing secularity, the big second wave of secularization, which of course is not, some kind of exogenous variable that just descends. I mean, it's co-related to these other things. It is co-related to these technological shocks. The other thing, and so we could talk more about religion. I think that's got to be a question on the table. The other thing that I think seems to create kind of so this question is sort of like you could have this downward shift to lower fertility rates, but what gets you lower? Like what keeps the cycle going? And one thing that really came out of my research was the thought that, or the notion that smaller family sizes inevitably breed smaller family sizes because of the lack of experience. So the typical child growing up in a 3-child home, let's say the 3-child is smaller from the 5, when you get below a certain threshold, then the typical child reaches adulthood with no memory of ever living with a baby. And that's something nobody's thought much about, right? So you have no memory of living with a baby ever. And if you don't have cousins and aunts and uncles, you actually have no experience at all. And so then the problem is, how do you think about choosing a thing against these cultural headwinds that Tim is describing when you're not really sure what the payoff is? Like, you don't remember that it's, they're a pain, but they're really great, right? There's all this. So I think that's the sort of thing that I would like to highlight in terms of what is it that people can't choose a thing? They don't have any familiarity with it. So it's just it's just like the meme wars, like that's all there is to think about.
I think that's really well put. And you've seen in The Atlantic and I have trouble keeping these magazines straight. The Atlantic, New Yorker, whatever, over the last few months.
You are a journalist. I mean, this is what you do, right?
If I actually had the physical magazines, I could probably tell, but their websites...
They're digital.
Screenshots on X.
Their websites look the same. No, my mom says she didn't know I wrote an article the other day because I didn't post it on Twitter, so that's how it works. But the one about the decline of... It said, what happened to the American babysitter? Don't tell mom the babysitter is dead. It was the headline. And then the other was about the lack of cousins. And these things are that's the reality. And you show these to some of our kids and they say, I can't even name all my cousins. But in so much of America, people don't have cousins. If you have 1.7 babies per family, then most people don't have a younger sibling. And then throw in the memory. Most people's younger sibling is born when they're 3 or whatever. I think there are a dozen other ways in which low birth rates beget low birth rates. And so out of South Korea, there are all these stories about how the coffee shops and increasing places, museums, libraries are starting to say no kids allowed. Because if you're not used to kids, you become less tolerant of kids. And then also just the built environment. They tear down the playgrounds in these neighborhoods in South Korea where they're not being used, and so it just becomes harder to do it. In the population shifts in Japan, where the small villages where the kids used to, 60 years ago, run around totally unsupervised, and parenting was relatively easier, and there was a payoff. There was a return on investment to kids because these were agricultural things. Those villages get shut down because they can't afford the plumbing and et cetera, and the only place to move is Tokyo, where, while they are building more and more, it's still up against a headwind to be able to have enough space to have kids. So in 100 ways, I think that falling birth rates beget falling birth rates, which cuts against Thomas Malthus's model, which was, well, lower birth rates will make people wealthier, give people more room, and then birth rates will rebound. That isn't happening. Now, maybe they're flatlining. Maybe there's a floor. I don't know.
Doesn't look like it.
Well, all right, we're going to talk about the apocalyptic future in a sec. But so two points before we get to the wolves running through the streets. First, so just in my own experience and my wife's, it was completely the case that when we had kids, we had our first child right here in D.C. in Capitol Hill. We were both one of two siblings. Neither of our siblings had kids at that point. Very few of our friends had kids. We were not part of, a vast network. And we were just totally undone initially by the experience. And the only thing that sort of helped us was that I had a younger sister who was 9 years younger than me. So I had some experience of sort of, quasi-parenting, and my wife had been a babysitter, right? At age 12, she had been, handed people's infants, which is actually in the current culture kind of unimaginable. This was normal, right? In suburban Connecticut in the early 1990s, you'd have a baby, and there'd be some, 12-year-old girl from a few houses over, and you'd hand the baby to this 12-year-old girl and go out for dinner and a movie. And people still do that, but they do it at a much lower rate. And honestly, we've never done exactly that, right? It's like a sort of vanished cultural practice. But yeah, so those things helped us, and so did having a few other sort of similarly bewildered new moms on our street. So like all of our personal experience bears that out. But what's interesting to me is that like we tell these stories about, secularization, decline of religion, and so on, and it's like it does make sense in a way, but you could imagine like a totally different story being true, right? You could imagine that as people's belief in God and an afterlife diminishes, that they become more attached, right, to family, and like what form of immortality do you have if not through your children, right? It's just sort of, this is less a question than an observation, right? The moderator's prerogative. But it is interesting that there's been kind of a revelation, I think, through this, right? Like you could have imagined a more secular future being one where people found, deprived of cosmic meaning, found more meaning in familial ties. And it's just striking to me that isn't where it's ended up.
I think it's because it's the stories they end up with are ultimately sad. Even the stories that the secular world ends up with that they think are going to be happy. Taylor Swift in her NYU graduation ceremony said something along the lines of, "I have good news and bad news. The good news is that your life is a blank script, blank page, and you get to write your whole script, and it's all up to you. And the bad news is all up to you." And I think it really is bad news to start with a blank life script and write it. The Vox.com had a good story today on the promise of egg freezing, and one of these companies said, we each have to invent our own brand new future. That's supposed to be a happy story. I think it's a sad story, combined with the loss of a loving God and the loss of and the guilt becomes heavier because you don't have sort of contrition and forgiveness and all of that. I think that the secular story was ultimately a sad one. So I do think you can have a secular society that's more fecund than ours is today, but I also think America might be at the upper limit and that's probably largely fed by, I think Israel is probably at the upper limit. Secular Jews in Israel have 2.0 babies because they live in a religious society. And But I think that it's a sadness, and that's the last chapter of my book. I think that the secular story, the godless story, ends up being too sad to want to continue the human race.
I think I'm going to say something sadder. Actually, no. I think,
Double down.
Actually, I'm doubling down. Yeah, that's right. And we can move into apocalyptic wolves roaming the street. Louise Perry calls this mentality of like thinking about the apocalyptic demographic collapse being a collapse-tard. And I heard that. I thought, I guess that's what I am. That's what I am. But no, so I think your point about, well, maybe if we lose God, why not children? Why not family? I mean, I think you can imagine a secular culture in which family ties were much more highly prized, and I think we've known a lot of cultures like that over time. I think what I'd like to focus on is whether we can expect outside of, let's say a Judeo-Christian tradition, whether we can expect to see the child, the naked infant, as in a sense universally valuable. So it seems to me that most cultures outside of Judeo-Christian tradition have tended to see some children as essentially instrumental, right? So your children are instrumental in the sense that they carry on your name. I mean, that's instrumental. They carry on the family name. They're good stock, right? And so what do you do with the ones that don't meet those instrumental needs? I mean, you expose them, you sacrifice them. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you do. And I think it's basically universal. I mean, we pro-life Americans would like to believe that legal abortion is a kind of aberration in human history. And in some ways it is, right? I mean, we have this, in some ways it is. But in other ways, it's not. In other ways, if you walk backwards through time, you find that in every non-Christian society, if we go back far enough, you really do have a kind of instrumentality of the child. And what's really interesting to me, and has become more interesting to me after doing this project, is that there's a single claim. I mean, there's a single claim about every human life being valuable, and that is not a universal, I think, in human society, that every life is valuable, not because of its quality or the end that it serves, but because the child is an end in itself. I think that that's a special claim, and it's not a universal claim, and it's something that good societies are always needing to reclaim. That's the first point. And the second point is to see how really quite interesting it is that the central assertion of Christianity is that not only that every child is, but that God became man as a human infant. And that reality is supposed to color the way we see the value of human infancy. So this is why I'm not terribly optimistic that I think we could see a secular culture that's more tribal and more family-oriented, but not universally child-oriented in the way that I encountered in my interviews.
I'm trying to decide if I want to go straight to the apocalypse. So 7:20. But one more thing, but before we go full into doom, marriage, right? If Lyman Stone were here, the talented demographer that we've spoken of, he would point out that, look, if Americans just got married at the rate, they did 20 years ago, right? And had, if basically married fertility in the U.S. were more normative, right? Meaning just more people get married and have the same, sorry, I'm not framing this exactly right, but basically married people are still having enough kids to reproduce the human race. And one of the big shifts of the last 20 years is just fewer people are getting married. And I'm curious what either of you, I mean, I think Catherine, in the stories you tell, a big, one of the core challenges, right? You talked about women and work and the desire for professional life and so on, right? One of the core challenges in marriages now is that there isn't a clear and certain model, right, of what a successful marriage looks like, what the balance of work between the two spouses look like, right? So in part, some of the women you talk about continue to work, some of them work part-time, right? But like families that have a bunch of kids, I know this is true of my family, are always working out balances, I think, in a way that wasn't the case to the same degree in 1957. So I'm wondering if you could say something about that, and then Tim can, say how people should find dates. Right.
I mean, are we going to transition to like what age are your kids and which ones of yours are still single?
That's over. That's what the hors d'oeuvres are for.
I mean, really briefly, I think the point about, I think one of the virtues of the stories in the book is that there's kind of an exposition. There's not one way, but when goods are in conflict, what you need and what I think human beings do is, you need to order them. So, I mean, there are all kinds of things I might have liked to have done and books I would have liked to have written 20 years ago. But I thought, I always kind of thought like having another kid was a way better idea than writing an academic journal article. Is the president here? No, he's not. I mean, I think our rankings would be better.
He only came to the UFO event.
He only came to the UFO event. Yeah, that's what I thought. But but where did I get that idea? I mean, of course, it wasn't an idea that was related to the bottom line or like the my path to tenure or anything like that. It was just a pretty clear idea. Like, look, okay, I'm only going to be 25 once, and I could probably write some dusty old papers when I'm 50, but I'm not going to have this child. I mean, so just I think what faith adds to the equation. It's not that it eliminates the fact that these things are all in tension and there's all this balancing that has to take place. But it provides this constant kind of lodestar. This is the most important thing. When these two things are in conflict, fit this one around that one, not the other way around.
Can I? Before I go to Tim, I'm just going to follow up on that because I think but you did work,
Me?
right? Yes,
yeah,
right.
I did.
Yes, and.
But not very much.
No, not very much. No, but I mean, but
in my 20s,
right? But like,
in my 20s, I work a lot now.
Speaking as someone who has, I have not personally born children, right?
I'm glad.
Yeah, that's an important admission, right? And my wife does not work full time, but she has worked.
Yeah.
She, has written 2 books while we've been having kids. Mm-hmm. She, God help her, has a contract for a 3rd book, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And something that I've thought about a lot, where I think a certain line of kind of, you could call it like feminist pronatalism, right, is onto something, is that there does have to be some kind of male adaptation, right, in this landscape. Like, Amy Coney Barrett's husband, right, is famously very helpful, right, with the kids. And the model, there is a model of, I mean, Tim, you alluded to this a little bit, talking about sort of positive changes in fatherhood, but there is a burden, a particular burden on fathers, I think, in this landscape to sort of help figure out what the models are that enable a family. Some families are going to be single breadwinner, mom stays home with the kids and so on, but there are going to be a lot of families where you're trying to order goods but not set a good aside completely, right? And I'm just interested in what you guys think about that sort of paternal juggle in a way as part of a response.
So it's interesting. So a couple of quick stories. One, I was on Capitol Hill. Melissa Carney, not related to me, spells her name different, but she wrote a book on how having a pair of married parents was actually good for kids. She's a liberal economist, and she basically got canceled for proving this.
She's okay.
And so
fine.
She,
just to be clear.
Yes. But she was at this event, and there's this one Republican staffer. It was an event on Capitol Hill, and she raised her hand and she said, "How can we get men?" This was a woman who wanted to be married and have kids, but have a career. She said, "How can we get men to embrace more equitable approach to the tasks of caregiving?" And I just thought, step one, stop talking that way. Like, I do not want to be a partner in caregiving. I want to be a dad. And so that's like Christine Emba, who's a Washington Post or now Atlantic writer, she's written a couple of, we need new, not just old, restoring the old model, but new models of good manliness. And I would say that, to use a couple terms of derision from Twitter from last decade, wife guys who are proud of their large adult sons and of their daughters. So on Twitter every once in a while I post pictures of me destroying my children in basketball and mini golf, and because this is one of the real fun things about being a dad. My wife gets no pleasure. Will get no pleasure out of swatting little Eve's jumper, but I get lots of pleasure out of doing that. And so that's something that I do think our pop culture can celebrate. That would be, this is my version of what I call feminist fecundity, is like dads be more thoroughly invested. There was a guy, the other story is there was a guy at my old parish in Maryland where we were all hanging around and talking at like a Friday night fish fry or T-ball or something. And he said offhand, he's like, oh, my only job is to make the money that pays the mortgage. And I said, Brad, you know that's not true. Like you coach your daughter's like second grade basketball team. You're thoroughly involved. But he sort of thought in this like manly culture that that's what he was supposed to say. And I was like, okay, that's what needs to not be there. So dads being different from moms, and husbands being proud of being husbands, proud of their wives. These are things that are not the same as a 1950s, 1960s culture, but are definitely not the same as the sort of vision of gender symmetry or whatever. That's my rough idea of one of the cultural changes that could be pro-family, is exalting an image of dads qua dads, husbands as husbands, being family first sort of guys.
So I wrote about this a little bit in one chapter. So the dads that you're describing, like you two guys, you're really unusual. I would say that all but one of the people I interviewed, the dads, the men, I would say that they served as like breadwinning gatekeepers. So the women described their husbands as sort of these kind of heroes who said, you know, honey, if you want to have another one, I'm ready to support. We'll make it work. But the dads weren't sort of leading the charge. They were kind of like, well, look, you know, you want to keep going, right? It's on you. There was one case where the dad was leading the charge and he really wanted to have 9 kids. Least religious couple I interviewed. It's a great story. But actually, the point here is that I think we say in the sociological literature that women are the sexual gatekeepers. Women essentially say when relationships will proceed to being sexual. Men are the breadwinning gatekeepers. They have to support somebody whose time is out of the workforce essentially, and you know all those other things like playing basketball. So an interesting question is like, how many kids do men want? You know, so it turns out we don't really know because the feminists just decided not to ask men. No, this is actually true. It turns out that the feminists just assumed that what patriarchy meant was that men always wanted to have 1 million children, and that the only reason anybody had children in the past was because of patriarchy. And so, but the funny thing is that most of the high quality evidence we have about the contribution of children to happiness, and from the twin studies, this is really really well done research, suggests that babies, children, young children, contribute more intensely to women's happiness than to men, conditional on already being in a partnership. It's a little bit technical. The point is, I think that we need to be looking at that question. Why on earth are these men saying yes to these larger families if their wives want to go for it? Because they believe children are the purpose of their marriage. Right? So this is going back to your question. Like, can we get above replacement for, like, I don't know if we can do that.
So apocalypse then, right?
Yeah.
So where again? So then we'll take questions, right? But I had this thesis. I wrote a book about it, right? That sort of the developed world was in what I described as sort of a decadent condition, yes. Which meant, in my sort of unique but stolen from Jacques Barzun definition, sort of stagnation at a high level of sort of wealth and civilizational development, right? And part of my assumption there was I had a chapter about low birth rates. I treated that as sort of a symptom of decadence, but even there, I was writing this 5 or 6 years ago now, I sort of had the assumption that birth rates would be below replacement, but at a level that sort of led to, gradual economic decline, but not incredibly dramatic transformations. And personally, that assumption I think has been challenged just by the sense, and Tim, you were talking about this before, right? But like the evidence, or both of you were talking about this, that like actually there isn't a floor in the way one might have assumed. And you can see examples in Asia and Southern Europe and maybe soon Eastern Europe and even the Nordics suggesting you can get to half replacement. You can get to points where real decline just gets baked in. So I'm curious just what you guys think is going to happen, right? That, in the sort of Carney vision, especially in America, I think you can imagine, sort of healthier culture, better public policy, things turn around a bit. And the Pakaluk vision, maybe not, right? I would say maybe I'm closer to the Pakaluk vision than I was 5 or 10 years ago. But I'm just curious, just generally, what you guys think the next 75 years is going to look like. If you don't mind, in 30 seconds or less, and then we'll take questions.
Well, yeah, Tim is funnier, so I'll let him go second. But you're not more optimistic? I don't know. Well, first of all, look, I think there's a twist to this, but I think for sure it's going to be poorer, right? Be sure. Like, so you talked about economic stagnation. So you kind of hit this decadent point, and I think you're quite right to highlight this. I mean, this inflection point relates as much to wealth as to a certain trend towards the workforce. So we're going to be poorer because what's going to happen is like the party's going to be over, and basically there aren't going to be. We're going to say like, well, who's producing the stuff? And there's no one going to be producing the stuff, and so there will be stagnation, economic stagnation. It won't be like anything we've had before. It won't be a depression or recession. We don't actually have a way to. We don't have a commonly accepted, like, set of metrics for defining what it looks like when you have decreasing productivity, but actually kind of like everybody's employed. We don't know what that is. We need a new name. And we will have new names for this, but we'll be poorer. Governments will be smaller. So that's just going to happen. Like, whether or not we can agree that the welfare state made things worse or made things better, we can't agree. It won't matter. We will not be able to pay for welfare states and big government programs. They will dry up. So we'll be like poorer, and there'll be less stuff to go around for a while, and then so that's kind of like, okay, that sounds really dark. And then what? And then the wolves roam the streets.
No, well,
but what I was going to say is, but listen. But here's what this is why it's very difficult to predict these things, because one of the core elements of my argument here is that this isn't structural in the way that a lot of people want to think of structural things, in the sense it's like completely inevitable. When things are essentially they're a collective outcome of an individual rationality. All the people are deciding, facing the same sort of sets of incentives, and they're making the right decision for them. When information changes, all the decisions can change. So, in fact, if you have a new evangelization, if we're going to use that language, this whole thing can change. It can change very quickly. So, part of the sort of like last thing I'd want to say right before I hand it off to somebody much more optimistic than I am is that I think churches and religious people are actually holding the one thing that can make the biggest difference, right? Because it's either true or it's not true that children are blessings, that they're always valuable. Like, this is true or it's not true. And if it's true, it's not propaganda to say it. If it's true, it's true. And it's in fact like a saving grace. And if it's true and it's not propaganda, people can begin to believe this. So I actually think, although I think, mathematically the future is going to be poorer and somewhat more modest on lots of levels, there are now, in many places, these pockets of folks who believe that children are blessings and the children are the purpose of their marriage, and their kids marry each other. Like my son, who's one of 15, married a girl who's one from a family of 15, and like they're 20. He was 19 the day they got married, and they just had a baby last week. Not because, but not because of anything, special. These two kids just thought, well, that's the best thing you can do, right? Like, babies are the best thing you can do. And the point is, we don't have to wait around for sort of what my what people from the outside would call this breeding cults. That's what they like to, no, that's actually what they call us, breeding cults, people who just believe this thing. But we don't actually have to wait around for breeding cults to continue to populate these little corners. We've re-Christianized whole nations before. And as we manage to re-Christianize, birth rates will rise.
The marrying each other becomes a problem if we're too much of a subset of the society. My boys go to the Heights, and I joked that they're inventing a dating app that just gives you a list of all the girls you're not yet related to. But so to start with the doom and then try to end with some hope. Yeah, I mean, the negative effects of the low and falling birth rates keep going on, and it keeps making us sadder, and the sadder we are, the fewer kids we have. One of the problems, we talk here about how men and women are diverting politically in South Korea in all ways. Like, just men and women are becoming just two different subcultures that are having trouble communicating. And so and I think that is downstream from, they still have a large retired population and this shrinking working population. So the and then question that I'm surprised I don't get asked more about, and I don't address it in my book, is, okay, now all the baby boomers die off. And it's a small generation that's retired, our generation. At that point, do we shift from inflation to deflation? Because the population's actually shrinking. So we always talk about the short-term problem of the old age dependency ratio going high, and we don't have enough people to fix the leaky pipes when we call the plumber. But then eventually we'll be shrinking with people. So that's the real sort of wolves thing that I don't. Do you have an economic insight?
There's no word for it. I mean, we don't know what that looks like.
I mean, Japan, right?
Yeah.
We have a model in Japan.
But they still have a large number of retirees and that are dying alone. And so that's this horrible story. But then economically, when the population starts shrinking, that's when some people say, well, actually, that's when Thomas Malthus's model kicks in, and maybe people can get richer because there's fewer people, the pie gets split among more people. I don't believe that. I think that innovation comes from young people, and as you have fewer young people, you have less innovation. But
if each young person gets one Italian hilltop village all to themselves, think.
Anybody who's ever owned a home or tried to own a home is like looks at those propositions like no, never.
An entire
never,
hilltop village.
Never.
Anyway. All right, let's open it up to positive, optimistic, life-affirming, civilization-saving questions from the floor, and we have one microphone, two microphones. So I'll start with you right here, and we'll go for 20 minutes, and then we'll break.
Thanks. Should I just hold it? Thanks. Thanks for the talk. This was really great. My question has a lot to do with, I have 6 kids. How do I prepare my children for the apocalypse? It doesn't seem fair.
To bring them into it. So this is why people don't have kids. I don't want to. Miley Cyrus, I quote her in my book. I could have structured my book around her being the enemy, but I'm not going to bring my kids into a world that's not, where fish can't live in the water, yada yada. So I think most people are protected by if they're being raised in a subculture that's happy and alive and growing. And I think that as Catholics, and you go and you look at LDS, that the Mormon world, and that's there. And there's not a sense of impending doom. And in certain Catholic circles, you can be in there. And again, Israel, I went to Israel on a religious, spiritual pilgrimage, and I was able to book 2 extra days to try to interview everybody there because, again, their secular population is 2.0 kids. And I told my wife, I was like, I'm worried 2 days won't be enough to do all the interviews. It turns out Israelis, like New Yorkers, give you their opinions very quickly. So I had no shortage of opinions. And one of the first guys I run into in Tel Aviv, what seemed like this idyllic place. Like it's a school, but the parents will just hang out at pickup forever because it's like fun and they're hanging out and it's social. And this guy says, oh yeah, we have way too many kids here in Israel. And he points at Jerusalem. It's like the religious people there, the women are just in some fertility cult or whatever. And while he's telling me this, he's kicking a soccer ball back and forth with his 3-year-old. And at one point, his toddler walks up and he picks her up. And then his wife walks up, and I'm thinking, these people are going to have 4 kids. What a country. The anti-baby people are having real families. Because the culture there, what trickles down from the religion, is a culture where the everyday quotidian stuff says, send us your kids. The bus drivers, one guy said, the bus drivers have a real affection for little kids. You show up at a restaurant, and there are kids there until all hours. Nobody apologizes with a bag of earplugs and drink tickets for bringing their kid on the airplane. All of that trickles down from a religious culture to even a subculture. So if you're blessed to be able to send your kids to a Catholic school or immerse them in a pro-family thing, they can be to some extent protected against the worst parts of this, because the economic stuff that's outside, that's secondary in my mind to the sadness and despair of a shrinking and childless society.
I also feel like I should say something optimistic about America, because I think we've been talking about the declining American birth rate. It's real. All of the problems that Tim describes are real. At the same time, I think it is quite likely that in the low-growth dystopian future that Catherine has described, America will look like something of an outlier. America is still the most dynamic economy in the world. It is the place where people, often the best and the brightest from countries that are going to depopulate very quickly, are going to want to move. It's a place that still has, amid all of the secularization, a lot of dynamic and resilient religious communities. And as I've become more pessimistic about the global patterns, I've actually become more optimistic about America's place in the world in the year 2075 or 2090. It's not going to be, the century of communist China, after all. So if you have to be somewhere in this future, this is a good place to be. And you can tell your kids, esprit de corps, right? Who owns the future? They own the future, right? Yeah, I don't know. I sometimes say that to my kids, and they roll their eyes at me, and they're like, Dad's getting weird again. So anyway, let's take a question from this side, sir, in the blue or bluish shirt with the.
Thank you. At the outset, Ross, you mentioned that not too long ago this was the hobby horse of right-wing cranks, and this conversation aside, is that, at least from my perspective, still seems to be the case, whether it's Elon Musk on Twitter or other people in the culture.
Elon's a centrist. I don't know what you're talking about.
So
centrist.
Why do you think that concern for declining birth rates is something that is mostly right-wing coded? I could see it doesn't seem inevitable to me that would be the case.
I think that, so a lot of, Catherine said it well, a lot of feminism has said that having a lot of kids, having multiple kids is the patriarchy, and if the sort of left-wing version of our hyper-individualism is just autonomy is the one unsacrificable good. It's got to be the guiding star. And if you believe in this individual autonomy, you have to write your script. Getting married and having kids is not going to be part of it. You throw your autonomy into a bonfire when you do either of those things. And so I think that's part of it. And then just sort of, I think a lot of leftism over the last 30 years has been trying to make it toxic to talk about certain topics. So it's white nationalist puffery is one of the lines that Paul Krugman, racial puffery or whatever, to talk about it. They just constantly are setting up these tripwires. What their motive is for doing it, I don't know, but you have to be willing to have somebody say, you're just a racist who hates women. And I say, I think you're wrong, and go on. And the center left is more afraid of that than I am.
I think we also want to say that, agreeing with what's been said, but it's the left that really championed Planned Parenthood, and the progressive left. I want to say that not the center left, but the progressive left, and that project has been a failure, right? And that's what we're facing. So I think that for this to become the sort of a cause of folks who are, interested in progressive left causes will take a tremendous turnaround. I mean, Paul Ehrlich still does not admit that he was fundamentally wrong, right? And so that's the reason. I mean, I think that this is kind of basic question of whether we can plan birth rates better than God planned birth rates. And they are still completely attached to the narrative of reproductive control. So much so that we're going to go headlong into selecting which embryos get implanted, and that's the future of in vitro fertilization. And that that's how they still see in this dystopian future how we're going to solve the baby crisis. So they're leaning into their own mistake, which is that this intense attachment to reproductive control. So I think that's the reason it's still kind of right coded.
But I think on that score, the planning, the technology, that's some of, and I actually took the word pronatal out of most of my book when I thought, okay, I think I'm more pro-family. Because once I realized, Elon has more kids than I do, but by a different family model. And I'm not ready to endorse his...
A more traditional family model, some would say. The real traditionalism.
The real traditionalism. It's the secular traditionalism.
Yeah, so that is not just a left-wing thing. That idea of technology will solve this problem.
Well, and just to say something in maybe not defense of my left-wing friends, but one question is, I think there is a general and understandable anxiety about government intervention in intimate life decisions. That's not an unreasonable anxiety to have. I think there are people on the left who look at the Paul Ehrlich era, the population bomb era, the Planned Parenthood in China and India era, and say, yeah, that was bad. And the lesson of that is the state should not be that concerned one way or another about people's decisions, that we should just emphasize autonomy as an alternative to failed population control efforts. So there's a sense of sort of that in public policy debates as well as the cultural side. And then also, there's a sense that, there was a big, not big, but a substantial sort of left natalist perspective that said very hopefully, if you build feminist, family-friendly welfare states, you can sustain higher birth rates. This was the Scandinavian model, right, that a lot of people championed. And I think that was done in a spirit of good intentions and a sort of sincere pro-family vision. And it's, in the last 5 or 7 years, run into the same wall as other models, including conservative models in Poland and elsewhere, right? But there is sort of, there are reasons beyond just a sort of relentless pursuit of autonomy and so on that the left has struggled to sort of come to terms with this issue. But I agree with the panelists that it cuts against what have been dominant narratives about what progress is. Okay, sir in the front row, how are we doing? Sorry, I'll stop talking.
I want to keep pressing on this question of this topic being polarized in the United States, and I want to distinguish between the discussions like we predominantly had tonight about trends and just naming the problem, and then maybe proposed solutions like the pro-natalist movement. I'm curious, is there anyone in either of those communities who's really looked at the question of if there is enthusiasm for naming the problem and addressing it in communities of color in the United States? It's such a frequent criticism that this is just a concern for white people, but I've seen subcultures where that's not the case. Has anyone studied that? Does the pro-natalist movement care about that criticism and want to invite subcultures of color into this discussion?
I think that's a great question, and well, for one thing, every racial group in the U.S. is below replacement and falling, and I point that out to try to ward off a little the accusations that I care about this because I'm trying to preserve the white race or whatever, and that Planned Parenthood was eugenic, etc. But no, I don't. I don't know that it's a conversation that has sort of that the conversations have merged, from Hispanic or whatever communities or Black communities into sort of the broader discussion. And the liberals I see who are the sort of helpful allies are basically all white people too. So I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it more internationally, where you have sort of they're not sort of explicitly, well, sometimes they are explicitly pro-natalist, right? But there's a long-running sort of alliance of sorts between religious conservatives in the United States and African leaders and African cultures who have sort of, were sort of the front lines of effectively resistance to the kind of full Paul Ehrlich agenda. And that's, I think, been where most of the kind of across racial lines effort and vision has gone. And there does, I wouldn't say that in the current, I don't know, what
Yeah, I was going to say just to begin, I'm not, maybe you feel the same way. I don't consider myself part of a pronatal movement, so I don't know much about the pronatal movement, actually. I was writing a book till 3 minutes ago, and that took a long time, so kind of like waking up and trying to figure it out. But I think my general sense of what I'm beginning to see, I do not think this is yet a mainstream, I think most people that I talk to don't have a name for the problem, don't actually know it's a particularly big problem. So I think we're still in the place where anybody talking about this is pretty fringy. I don't think we're in the place where that movement, which I don't consider myself a part of, is trying to figure out how to broaden the tent. So I don't know. I'm mostly speaking from ignorance here.
Right here.
Hi. So this question is mostly for Catherine. The gentlemen on the stand are also welcome to contribute. But so my husband and I just finished your book. We both loved it. And I was intrigued by your report that many of the women you interviewed with 5 or more kids did work in some sense. I'm a mom of 2, and I'm 31, so I've still got time. But I have definitely had a lot of these struggles myself as I've thought about, my professional life and also a desire for a larger family. So what strategies, have you employed? Obviously you have. I'm amazed that you are where you are and have as many kids as you do, and very impressed. But also the other women that you studied, what strategies did you see them employ, and to what degree did they find those strategies successful?
Okay, so that's a really big question, and I'll just try to say a couple things in the interest of making room for further questions. And I'll stay to. Let me just say it very loud and clear, and I see from the cameras I'm on air. If this is being streamed, I do not think there's an ideal number of children for any family to have. So I'm going to say that again. I do not think there's an ideal number, and I didn't write this book to cast shade on anybody's family size or the blessings that they have or haven't received. I knew it was a risk that writing this that would happen, but so I want to say that. So I think the second thing, I would say that the thing that I thought was most interesting across the women in my book, which now you've read it, so was this posture of openness rather than acquisition. Right, so almost nobody said, well, I set out to have 10, or I certainly didn't think I would have 8. So openness rather than, so when there's kind of openness to a blessing, you're kind of looking for opportunities, like I'm open to having a drink, which means, sort of like, well, if somebody invites me, or I see a way that I might have a drink with friends, I'm kind of like, it's the sort of thing I think it's basically really good. And so insofar as I can make room in my life for that to take place, right? And I would say that's a sort of posture of openness that in itself leads you to take advantage of gifts of resources that you don't think you have today, but you might have them later, right? You think, well, I certainly in my own life went through phases where I thought I don't think I couldn't have another child right now. I'm too tired. Maybe I'm sick. But you think, well, but kids are good, and in principle, I'd like to be open to the next child, but I have to wait till I'm ready. So the posture of openness and the conviction that children are a blessing leads to this kind of dynamic dialogue with your spouse and with God, right? But like something that that Ross said that I really love. I mean, this thing that when we're younger, we're open to possibility, to innovation, right? There's a kind of expectation, like that you view the world as like, well, I might be blessed again, right? And maybe I'm not even ready to have this blessing now, but I might be able to be blessed again. I really wanted to try to get that dialectic out on paper, because people who don't see that, they don't know what this looks like. It's either acquisition. These are people who are just, they got married and they were trying to be the best Catholic or the best Mormon. You know, they want to beat everybody else, so they're going to have 6, so they're going to have 10, and, you know, like, there's nothing like what it is on the inside. So what does that look like? And I just think that, well, then, you say, I mean, I say to young women, like, look, God created the capacity that you have to have children, and that's a blessing. But God also gave you all the other gifts that you have. And do you think for 1 minute that if you put those things at his disposal and you say, look, these things are in your care, you made me this way, right? Like that line from Chariots of Fire, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And so all the women I've ever met who are young and who are thinking about their lives, and they realize and they are convicted that their fertility is the greatest gift, but they also know there's something else that God made them, either fast or able to read old books or whatever it is, like, do you think for a minute if you give that to God, he's not going to make use of that? Like, God wouldn't make use of that? And then, of course, when you say that, you people go like, oh, the problems melt away in a certain sense, because then it's really quite an intimate question, right? It's kind of like ongoing creativity and response. So I could say more later, but yeah, that's the in a nutshell.
I know there are a lot more questions, but it's 8, and I kind of think that's a really nice place to end. We're all here. You can come ask us more questions, except for Tim, who has to coach 6 Little League games in the next 45 minutes. But yeah, I think I'm going to close there, and thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions, but thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.